Hello and welcome to 52 Weeks. This is week number 10. We're going to finally wrap up chapter 2. I know this has been a long couple of segments that are through here. This is actually 5. It was good to break this down into sections. I know there's a lot here. This final section, we're going to be looking at this issue of zoning, and it's very good to know and think about the concept of form-based zoning. We're going to look at it around the city. So we look at the chapter here. There's an overview of the types of zoning that we have. I've listed it here. I've kind of changed up the order from smallest to largest, and we're looking at 9% commercial, 17% industrial, 18% recreational, 21% institutional, and 24% residential. So most of our zoning or most of our use that's there is on residential, a quarter of it. So what does that mean in playing out in the public realm? Well, so form-based zoning is different than your traditional method of zoning based on the use type. This looks at really understanding or trying to help provide what the public realm is. This is extremely important because public space is the thing that we inhabit as a city. It's where it's the stuff outside of the privately owned spaces. And the best cities are the ones that have a high concentration or high balance of good public space. These are the places you want to go and meet and hang out. It's also the form that begins to characterize a city. It's the reason why we go and visit places on vacation and go, oh, I just like being here. I like walking down the street. There's a plaza with a fountain, open spaces. It could be vistas. It could be boulevards. All these things. Think about when you travel next time, what is in the public realm that you're able to inhabit. And this has a relationship to all of the other edges. We understand edges where the edge is the membrane between private and public. So as soon as you step out the door, if you're in a resident, you're in your own private world. But then on the outside, when you step out, you're now in the public realm. And this is what's interesting. Cities have different characteristics because of that public realm. So form-based zoning, form-based codes address the relationship between building facades and the public realm, the form and mass of buildings in relation to one another, and the scale and types of streets and blocks. So again, this is important if you go and back to the original discussion we had about the city and the first episode of this regarding chapter 2 in land use it was about block size. It was about massing. We're looking at the edges of buildings, how buildings are put together. All of this matters. And unfortunately, the public doesn't always have a say on what this looks like. In cities that have a planning commission, some of this is mitigated within a planning commission that recommends what's happening. Our city planning commission kind of does this, but doesn't really get into what things look like. Per se. They will make recommendations. I know with the State Archives building, made recommendations for the side of buildings and what windows were there and that sort of thing. So they had some thought in there, but this is something that's really important in our public realm, particularly when a building goes up and it stays up pretty much for, if it has a good life cycle, it's going to stay up at least 50 to 75 years. If it's a residential one, at some point if it's a vinyl siding, it's going to need to be repaired. So that type of stuff's going to need to be changed. But any of the brick that's there, the form of the brick, the color, the size is important. In my area where I wander through and I taught at Hack, the biggest example of this was the Campus Square building in the corner of 3rd and Riley. It was a great building that what can go wrong in urban design. And one of the things you look at is the brick is oversized. It's using economy brick because it's cheaper and it's less labor to put up because it's bigger in size. But it also has 2 different color tones which aren't even too dissimilar. When you look at them, they look kind of alike. So it's trying to play this game of being a smaller building than what it is, but it really doesn't work well. The other thing that doesn't help is you also have joints in the brick based on the structure that tells you what type of structure is behind it. So that also doesn't play well in an urban environment. So now we have a building that's there and it's staying there for the life of the building, runs its course, which there was a lot of money put into it, particularly the geothermal, how many 400 geothermal pipes going into the ground. It's going to be there for a long time. Contrast to that is the building across the street, which is the Hack building, the Evangelical Press building, what that building was, and it was meant to stay and be there for a long time when it was originally built. But look at the details there. So it's a really good The street, if you walk on Riley Street, there's a really good discussion that can be had standing right in the middle or standing on the side and discussing this. So the form-based codes and form-based zonings is going to be thinking about this. It gets people to really understand what do they want to see in their neighborhood, and that's a thing to be qualitatively putting together. We look at form-based zonings. There are 4 land use typologies. These things kind of sort themselves. So first things, the most that we have is neighborhoods of historic housing stock. So Harrisburg has a pretty good size of this. The next is former industrial lands. They're 27%. Number 3 is parks and open spaces at 18%. And then the central business district and capital complex takes up 11%. Someone could be looking at this and thinking about from taxability point of view, and I know the number is with all the nonprofit and state buildings that we have, or government buildings we have, it's about 50% untaxable land, and that's one of Harrisburg's issues that's there. So what you want to do is, or what's the push been doing is, what do you do with that other 50%? How to capitalize on a higher revenue based on getting more properties on top of the land that's already there. This is a constant issue and has plagued Harrisburg for many, many years. As soon as I moved in, this is the realization that everybody talks about. We haven't really solved this and come up with a better way to look at it. One of the things I think it's fascinating is to get into the discussion of what would happen. This is where the economics professors and the economics gurus out there it'd be great to come and do an analysis of Harrisburg. There's a theory, I think, to look at the land value tax. What happens when we put more value into the land itself than the actual building? So Harrisburg has between land and the property or the building itself, the structure. So there's a tax on both things. So this would be interesting to see. Could we leverage things based on the land that's there? When we look at asset-based community development, one of the things we want to think about is the neighborhood areas of continuous historic buildings. We want to have a goal of conserving historic assets and promote a high-quality urban infill. So infill is whenever we have gaps in a block because of demolition, distress, neglect, and disinvestment. We want to refill these. And because right now, as soon as you lose one building in the block, the deterioration can begin, and it affects the net value of the overall block. And we want to try to fill in what's there. That's a very tough thing to do. It's a little more expensive, and it's also takes great skill to be able to do this. Philadelphia has some great examples of this happening, and they've gone really gung-ho around the city, particularly if you look at Fishtown and South Philly, how they do infill really well. You want to look at this in Housing Chapter 5, we'll look at this and how do we, continuous historic buildings, how do we build that back? Because not only do we have to build it back, but we also have to understand for a historic district in these neighborhoods. Next, we've got former industrial lands. We really want to maintain current successful industrial areas, ones that are working, plan for necessary expansion. What happens when they grow and where do they go to? One of the interesting things, we got D&H that's up in the corner of 7th Street. They got to a point where they've outgrown. The goal is understanding what's value does something bring to the city and how the city can continue to attract and maintain those relationships in a good way. This is a balance and not always easy. We also have a whole solar array that's up there on 7th Street, 7th Division. What happens to that as well? A lot of the developers I know the system really well, and they get stuff done. And some people look at that like, oh, that's a great thing for it to happen. Well, let's pick it apart a little bit. Was it so great? Did it really help? Who benefited from this initiative? And if the end result is that the payback into the city isn't as great, maybe we should start to evaluate this a little bit better. And that's why a planning commission is helpful in that if we have a paid planning commission that's always going after this and really a watchdog to making sure that they're defending for what the residents need in the city and what is best for the city. We can't assume that anybody coming in and doing something to the land is going to have a altruistic view of it. Let's be honest, developers are into development so that they can make money. Flippers are into flipping properties because they're into making money. The question I have is whether or not does that come back and benefit the community. I think we have to be smart as a city to actually evaluate every single intervention that happens in the city and run it through a course of checklists and say, you know what, this isn't necessarily the best move for the city. We don't do this to actually eliminate people's rights to do things on properties or parcels. The goal is understanding that in city development and urban development, there's a relationship between the property that's personal, private, and then the public realm. Again, it goes back to this public realm, public-private issues. So when we look at number 3, we got parks and open spaces. We want to strengthen the parks and open space system, incorporate ecological reserve areas from repurposed industrial lands, and then you can see chapter 4, the open space, parks and open space chapter. So when we look at the central business district, the capital complex, we've got a plan for expansion of the city's business district as a multimodal center, incorporating repurposed industrial lands, vacant land along the 6th Street corridor and north of Riley Street. So that's what that area is looking at. Like, how do we rework this? All right, so we look at some of the things in the last part of the chapter. It's just going through as more of a asset mapping of where things are. We look at our public facilities. We've got City Hall. We've got the fire department facilities that are here around the city. There's some really good discussions about what that is and where. We also have a proposed food network. This is something that, again, is proposed of where locations are in the area. This deals with a lot of the food deserts that we know exist. A lot of the nonprofit organizations do a great job out there in trying to provide for the need that's great around the city and distributing the food really well. And so this connects to the markets that we have, as well as potential market up in Allison Hill and anything related to up towards Hack and the Uptown Plaza. Lastly, this finally wraps up Chapter 2 and land use. We look at the educational facilities. These are the ones that are around Harrisburg and the potential with higher education and some connections with the Reservoir Park. And without getting any specifics, in here is the William Penn campus and also the Bishop McNevitt. And what do we do with reusing these? There's some interesting thoughts about those two structures. So if we really want to look at the form-based codes and form-based zoning and wrapping this chapter up, it's extremely important to understand how that affects our public realm. So we should be evaluating any moves within the form of the building. Now, we also should understand the long-term life cycle of buildings. So this is the next question we look at. What legacy will we have for the next generation? What our value is based on how we treat our buildings. I think that's a thing to be considering. And then even more importantly, how those buildings are being used to serve the needs of the people residing here.